Hello, here is the lecture on the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock by T.S. Eliot, which is probably one of the more difficult poems we will read this semester. So, I'm not going to read this first part in italics. This is an epigraph to the poem. It is in Italian. All you really need to know about this is that it is an excerpt from Dante's Divine Comedy, and the speaker is a person who is in hell. Um, and they're speaking to, oh, now I can't remember if they're speaking to Dante or Virgil. In any case, they're speaking to a poet. So we could think about this as a way of setting up what will happen in the poem proper, which is that Prufrock will be speaking to us, right? There's a you, let us go then, you and I. Um, and this is set up in some ways, it's kind of like a dramatic monologue, like we talked about in Victorianism. But the speaker, remember the speaker from the epigraph, is a person who is in hell. But unlike Dante's vivid Renaissance poem, late medieval, early Renaissance poem about heaven and hell, this is not the glorious, beautiful, vivid culture of the past for Eliot. And this is a theme we'll see over and over and over again in Eliot's work and in this poem in particular, which is a glorious past civilization versus our current kind of debased modern civilization, right? Instead of this speaker and Dante, or perhaps Virgil, depending on which part of the Divine Comedy we're in, we have Prufrock, who is not a hero of Renaissance poetry. It's a comparison that shows us how terrible our society is. So then the poem proper starts, let us go then, you and I, with a famous simile, when the evening is spread out against the sky like a patient etherized upon a table. Here we have, right, modernism kind of throwing the ugliness of technology and modern society in our face with this comparison of like nature, like the evening sky with an etherized patient. And the landscape through which Prufrock, Let Us Go, right, goes through is this kind of urban aesthetic. Half deserted streets, restless nights and one night cheap hotels, kind of a red light district, kind of a bad part of the city. Sawdust restaurants with oyster shells, right? Oysters are a notorious aphrodisiac. And these are the kind of restaurants where you like throw the shells on the floor. So they're really like cheap places. So he proposes to lead us through a kind of bad part of town, and a lot of this poem will be concerned with sexuality and romance, or the lack thereof, in modern civilization. And so we have this negative aspect of the city. Prufrock tells us, don't even ask what the overwhelming question is, right? Instead, he says, let us go and make our visit. And then this is these are lines that we will be repeated very significantly. In the room, the women come and go, talking of Michelangelo. So he's taking us to a party, probably some kind of like vaguely high class party. People are talking about art. They're talking about important art of the Renaissance, beautiful art, Michelangelo. But it's also kind of a like a, not sure if it's highbrow, maybe it might be middlebrow kind of thing for these women to be doing. They're not seeing the art, right? Like they're talking about it. Then we get this just like lovely description of the fog as a kind of cat, the fog in the city. And this is a good place to remember that the musical Cats is based on poetry by T.S. Eliot, which is all about, some of his poems are all about cats. So we get this again, very much an urban aesthetic, the yellow fog, which is pollution. But this great description of it as a cat. Then moving on to the second column, thinking about, okay, so he's saying, let's go to this party, kind of like a cocktail party, maybe like a tea party, or there will be time to prepare a face to meet the faces that you meet. If you think about going to a party, sometimes you literally put on a new face, like makeup and things like that. But sometimes you also just prepare a persona. You prepare yourself to be at the party, and this is this kind of lack of authentic selfhood. So he says, there'll be time for you and time for me, and time yet for 100 indecisions, for 100 visions and revisions. So Prufrock is kind of indecisive. We'll definitely see that in this poem. He can't decide what to do with his life. He feels like his life is meaningless. He is going back and forth about these kinds of decisions. And then we have this very mundane, part of the tea party, right? Like the toast and the tea. And this is kind of, in some ways, also kind of like Mrs. Dalloway, kind of like you're walking down the street and you think, oh my God, what have I done with my life? Right? Like Prufrock is, we're going to the party and it's like, oh my gosh, my life is meaningless. I've never really decided what I should do. I've never done anything big. And I'm thinking about, I'll have time to think about this a million times before I get to have tea at the tea party. And okay, in the room, we get the repetition of this line again. The women come and go. And part of Prufrock's concern and the decisions and the lack of decisions have to do around women and sexuality and kind of taking a chance. Indeed, there will be time to wonder, do I dare? And do I dare? Time to turn back and descend the stair with a bald spot in the middle of my hair. They will say how his hair is growing thin. He is very concerned with how he thinks people think he looks. So he's very concerned with self-presentation. He's also really concerned with aging, with being old. And so this is also an aspect of like going to a party, being in society, and he's thinking too much about the way people perceive him. And so, do I dare disturb the universe? This is this hyperbolic question, right? The kind of person that Prufrock is, which is this kind of not necessarily unattractive, but kind of boring middle-aged man who's never really done anything, and his interior monologue, right, is, do I dare disturb the universe? So, and do I dare is also linked to these women. Does he dare to make a pass at one of these women? And then he says, for I have known them all, already known them all, have known the evenings, mornings, afternoons. I have measured out my life with coffee spoons. I know the voice is dying with a dying fall beneath the music from a farther room. So how should I presume? Okay, so he says he knows all these people, or maybe he doesn't literally know them, but he's been in parties like this 1,000 times. He's met people like this. This is nothing new to him, and it's boring and meaningless. He talks about measuring out his life with coffee spoons. A coffee spoon isn't like a big spoon, it's like a little spoon. And so he's just been kind of measuring his life out in a little way, day by day, never doing anything big or major, which is kind of sad. Um, I know the voice is dying with a dying fall. The with a dying fall is actually a reference to Shakespeare's Twelfth Night with the Duke of, which is a comedy about romance and people in love. And the character who says this is a character who is very romantic and very much in love with various people. And so again, we get this contrast between this kind of glorious romantic love of the past and Prufrock going to this party where he feels like he knows everybody, even if he doesn't, and he like can't decide whether he wants to make a pass at someone. So it's this kind of debased situation. He says, I've known the eyes already, known them all. And then he talks about feeling pinned like a bug, which I think is a very, it's a feeling you can have at a party that's very human and very relatable, of feeling like pinned down by other people and them talking to you. And he talks about, he thinks about how can I spit out the butt ends of my days and ways. So like the cigarette butt ends of his life. And if we think about this, the way he is characterizing his life as measured out in coffee spoons and just like a bunch of cigarette butts, it's not great. This is not a good representation of his life. And again, he also says, like, I've known the arms already, known them all, right? Like, one woman is very much like another. He feels like it doesn't make a difference, you know, if it's this woman or another woman. You might notice that, like, none of these women has a name, or anything seems to be special about them. So it's just kind of sexuality in general, um, for Prufrock. And we continue, like, shall I say I have gone at dusk through narrow streets? Again, we're back to our urban aesthetic. He thinks I should have been a pair of ragged claws scuttling across the floors of silent seas. So it's like I should be like a crab or a lobster. But we can think of Prufrock at the bottom of the sea, isolated, cut away from other people, thinking about the Dante metaphor. In Dante's Inferno, the lowest level of hell, the one where the devil is not hot. It's icy cold, and it's like it's a lake of ice. And so I also think this maybe is a kind of reference to that, which is this is being kind of at the bottom of hell. And Prufrock is in his own personal hell, which for Eliot at this moment would probably also just be modern civilization and modern society. Um, then we have this, but Eliot can also be lovely, this like lovely description of the afternoon and the evening personified, kind of sleeping, stretched out on the floor, again, perhaps like a cat. And again, Prufrock asking himself this question: should I, after tea and cakes and ices, have the strength to force the moment to its crisis? Like, so again, after the tea party, does he have the strength to make a pass at one of these women, to make a romantic or sexual gesture? He says he's wept and fasted, wept and prayed. Although I have seen my head grown slightly bald, brought in upon a platter, I am no prophet. This is a reference to John the Baptist, whose head in the Bible, like, there's only one person whose head gets cut off and put on a platter, and that's John the Baptist. And Salome does that in the Bible, right? Salome is this famous seductive woman who does the dance of the seven veils, and she does her sexy dance, and the king says, I'll give you anything you want. And she says, I want the head of John the Baptist on a platter. So it's this moment of seduction and temptation and tragedy. But as Prufrock notes, like, he's no John the Baptist. Um, this is not that situation. And in fact, he says, I've seen the moment of my greatness flicker. They're, and presumably like a candle, and it's kind of gone out. Like, he hasn't had a moment of greatness. And the eternal footman, that's death. and Death basically just kind of laughs at Prufrock, and he's afraid. And so then there's this question, would it have been worth it after all? Would it have been worthwhile to have a sexual relationship, to have a romantic relationship? And then we get to have bitten off the matter with a smile, to have squeezed the universe into a ball and roll it. This is an explicit reference to Andrew Marvell's Renaissance seduction poem, To His Coy Mistress, which is a poem about seizing the day and living for now, specifically living for now by having sex with your mistress. It's incredibly sexy and romantic, and instead of that poem, we get this again, right? Eliot constantly contrasting the glory and romance of the past, even though it may have been tragic and bloody, with the kind of meaningless, boring, soulless nature of modern society. He also, Prufrock also imagines, he says, like, I'm Lazarus, come from the dead. And he imagines, okay, this fictional woman who is presumably lying in bed with him saying, well, that's not what I meant at all. And we get this failure of language and failure of communication. And he is just not what she wanted. Even if he were Lazarus, which he is not. He is not John the Baptist. He's not a character from Shakespeare. He's not Lazarus. But this woman, he thinks this woman would not want him. So, again, this continued question, would it have been worth it after all? Would it have been worthwhile? Would a romantic relationship be worth it? He says it's impossible to say just what I mean. And he imagines this woman, right, turning away from him, and saying that's not it at all, that's not what I meant at all. So he just can't imagine a relationship where there is communication or romance or any kind of fulfilling sexuality. He says, in addition to the list of things that Prufrock is not, he is not John the Baptist, he's not Lazarus, he is also not Prince Hamlet. He's not the hero. He's not a tragic hero. Instead, we get this long description of an attendant lord, which is Polonius. And Polonius is in the play can be kind of like a blowhard, and this kind of old doofusy guy who accidentally gets murdered, halfway through the play, and he's, as Prufrock says, almost a fool. So Prufrock's like, I'm not the hero, I'm not the main character in my own life, right? I'm, like the fifth male lead who's kind of a doofus. So, and again, there's this preoccupation with aging. I grow old. And at this moment in time, rolling your trousers is very much not cool, right? He recognizes that he is, like, old people are going to be, not fashion forward. Shall I part my hair behind? This means like having a comb over. Do I dare to eat a peach? We go back to that do I dare to, we've gone from do I dare disturb the universe to do I dare eat a peach? I shall wear white flannel trousers and walk upon the beach. So he has this kind of image of what his life will be like when it's old, and it's very small, right? It's like, am I going to have a comb over? Am I going to eat a piece of fruit? Thinking about, okay, we can think about peach. It's also temptation, and the sexual aspect of eating a peach would surely even be present in Eliot's day as it is in our own. Right? He spent this whole poem basically wavering about whether he's going to make a sexual overture to one of these women. And then he says, I've heard the mermaids singing each to each. I do not think they will sing to me. the mermaids from classical literature, sirens, we would say, are sexual temptresses, right? Who lure sailors to their deaths by singing sexy songs at them, and then the sailors jump over and drown and die. And then actually the mermaids kind of eat them, and their sexuality is terrifying and predatory and aggressive, but they are also beautiful. Um, Elliot, well, that's a slip. Prufrock thinks I am so boring and unattractive that the sirens aren't even going to try and lure me to my death. Right? They won't. I don't think they'll sing to me. Um, I am just not. Nobody wants to connect with me. I am alone. I am alienated. Um, so then I have seen them riding seaward on the waves. Eliot can be beautiful as well as weird and difficult. And this last part of the poem is incredibly beautiful about the mermaids and how beautiful they are. And he says, we have lingered in the chambers of the sea by sea girls wreathed with seaweed red and brown, till human voices wake us and we drown. So it is not the temptation of our classical sexy lady monsters, the mermaids, that is going to lure us to our doom, right? Human voices wake us. And again, if we think of him as like, go back to that thing about being a crab and being beneath the sea and being isolated, maybe in our own personal hell, cut off from everything. It is when human voices wake us and pull us out of this, and the result is not like connection or fulfillment or anything like that. The result of that is the drowning. We are kind of drowning even though there's a moment of human connection. And this poem was written before Stevie Smith's Not Waving but Drowning, but like we have a lot of similar points here, right? You can think of that as kind of the easier version of Prufrock, which is that um, even connection to other people isn't going to save us because modern society is terrible. And um, even if we wake up from this, even if we think about coming out of our chamber in the sea, we will drown. Um, Kind of depressing stuff. Style wise, I want you to notice how, like, there are places, if you look at this last section, where we have rhyme, but it's not always regular, and the meter is not always regular. This, like the Hollow Men, this is free verse. It's fragmented as well, although maybe not quite as fragmented as the Hollow Men. But we have so many of these modernist thematic and stylistic elements here. So, Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock is really a quintessential modernist poem. And you can see not just Eliot, but modernists, Woolf too, in Mrs. Dalloway, Stevie Smith, Eliot, this perception or this kind of repeated statement of being far out at sea as a way that people feel in modern society. They feel isolated, they feel detached from other people, even if they might be in the middle of a bunch of other people, like Mrs. Dalloway is in London. There's that part in Dalloway where she talks about feeling so far out to sea and connecting that to isolation and alienation from modern society, feeling like you're the only one and you could be surrounded by people, but you don't have a human connection. So, cheery things to think about. But We have Auden for Wednesday, and we'll be back in the physical classroom for Wednesday. Thanks.